good afternoon. Thank you, Professor Steiner-Khamsi, for being here with us today. I will just give you a short bio from Gita Steiner-Khamsi, who is already very well known. But as Jordi said, we want to hear you, so I will be very short. Gita Steiner-Khamsi, Professor Gita Steiner-Khamsi is a professor of comparative and international education at Teachers College, Columbia, since the year 1995. Although since this year she has a double appointment, a dual academic appointment, because she will be half of the year working in the context of as a director of NORAC, the Global Network on International and Educational Development, and the other semester she will continue working at Teachers College in Columbia University. She has been also the president of CIS, that is the Comparative Education Society of the US, and is co-editor of two very important book series in comparative education. One with Routledge, the World Yearbook of Education, and the other one with Teachers College Press, that is called International Perspectives on Educational Reform. She has published several books on topics related to global education policy, policy studies, policy borrowing and lending. Her areas of work are basically the post-socialist region with a focus on Mongolia and Central Asia. And when it comes to thematic focus, she has recently worked on two main areas. One of it is the global standardization movement, and this is why PISA and other international learning student assessment are so important. And the other one is the increasing role of the industry and the private sector in public education, so what we have come to call the global education industry. So I think that today's presentation is very good in the sense that combines these two research strands, because you will focus on the increasing role and interest of private actors in the movement of international learning student assessment. And actually I leave you with Gita Steiner-Khamsi and her presentation, her masterclass titled Understanding Business Interest in International Large-Scale Student Assessment, a focus on PISA and TIMSS. Thank you, Gita.
Thank you. So what I'm presenting you today is one part is a study that I did actually with two master's students from Columbia University Teachers College. It was a media analysis of three outlets, financial media I would call them, the Financial Times, the Economist, and Wall Street Journal. Their names, the names of the two students are Margaret Appleton and Shezleen Vellani. I know that they're watching this right now because I sent a note about the streaming to them also. So this is the main part, number 2, and the other main part is actually the number 4, speaking the language of the other, and that's the title of this presentation. For the longest time, and that's going to be one of my points I want to bring over, for the longest time, the state was almost the enemy in education. We would always analyze the role in the state of brainwashing its citizens to have, social cohesion, or we could say social oppression or assimilation, and it was always about the nation state and education, the role of public education to prepare the citizen in the nation state and what it did to minorities. So for the longest time, education was at the focus of policy studies in education, trying to understand the role of the state, and then in the last 20 years, the changing role of the state, from one that is very active to one that only regulates and oversees and accredits. And the fast advance of the education industry, and this is the point I want to bring over, is we should try to understand why are businesses interested in education. So rather than trying to see like a state, and I like this title of the book by Scott very much, we should start to think why businesses find education lucrative and interesting. So we should start calculating like a business in order to understand the business logic involved in education. So let me start in a very systematic manner. I try to keep it to half an hour, not more, or 40 minutes, so we have time for discussion. Let me start out, a bit systematically to show in what bigger body of research this type of research is situated. There is this really interesting research that is being carried out by actually younger scholars in comparative education, especially Camilla Addy and Sam Seller. And I know Tony was invited together with Bob Lingard and myself to add to their research. And I will talk a little bit about what they did. I'm trying to understand why do different countries and policymakers engage in PISA. And PISA is just a generic term. Let's just use PISA for all international large-scale assessment. It could be TIMSS, it could be PEARLS, it could be others. So reasons for engagement, that's the topic of this type of scholarship. Some of us in that group are looking at reasons for disinterest or unengagement, like in the US, like Nancy Green Saraski, she's a doctoral student who finished last year at Teachers College. She analyzes why is nobody interested in PISA in the United States. That's an interesting question also. So what are the reasons why more and more countries participate? What do they get out of it? Why do they buy in, to use Tony's term? But, Phillips, David Phillips would use the term attraction. What is the attraction of PISA, etc.? So all these reasons for participation or reception or why does it resonate, this is a big body of scholarship that only, I would say, started recently, 2-3 years ago. And it only started because of the astounding success, actually, especially of PISA, from something that started with 28 countries in the year 2000. Now I think 78 or something like that have participated in 2015. And the same for TIMSS. In the beginning, the IEA studies, they started in the early 70s. There were only very few, like the civic education study, the first one had 10. And then, the first maths and science study, and two also now over 50. So there is a need to understand what's going on, why those studies are interesting for different policy actors. In policy borrowing research, there are two terms that we always use, reception and translation. And so the reception is all about why does something resonate? For instance, accountability reform or higher education quality assurance, another global education policy. Why do countries at a particular moment adopt a policy or import or borrow? And you can see it is the local context is at the center, because in system theory we look at the system and use the system as an explanation for why something resonates. It's different than the neo-institutionalist approach from Stanford that has a bird's view of things, or a top-down. Top-down is maybe a negative word. I don't mean to be critical on that, but it's just another, the institutionalist way of looking at it is different. It's about looking at world polity and global governance and how that, and global scripts that influence. The system theory perspective is all about looking at the system, at the local context, and looking at reasons why something resonates or is needed, or the uses of the adoption for the local context. It's a very active, agency-driven approach that takes into account power relations also. And of course, the other important term in policy borrowing research is translation. How is something that is imported or borrowed, what does that mean in the cultural context or in the socio-cultural context? That's why many of us are close to anthropologists without using ethnographic research, but we use culturalist conceptions. Reasons for engagement, in my opinion, looks at the reception side. Why does something resonate? Why is something attractive? And the question here is, why is education attractive to businesses? How do they talk about it? Why do they reference it? Has it changed over time? These are the kind of questions I looked at. Reasons for engaging with PISA. This is the study that Camilla Addy and Sam Seller started. It's a very good piece of research, very interesting. It was developed in a dialogue among the 5 authors, with Sam and Camilla taking the lead. So what you have here is they looked at different reasons. Usually we think PISA, especially looking at the PISA shock in Germany, and I heard that there was a PISA shock in Norway also. We always think PISA is used in order to generate reform pressure, like for political mobilization. Or in some countries, we think it's used for economic resource mobilization, because you can make an argument that there is a need for having more funds for public education. But they went deeper. They looked into some countries just want to participate in PISA in order to show that they're in this, what Antonio Novoa would call, in this international space. Some would use it actually to learn from curriculum and policy issues in other countries. So these are all the different reasons, and it's not only the political and economic dimension. Now the question is, and this is analyzing how government, when we look back at this article, what we really did is we didn't look why business people or researchers or the professionals use PISA. We looked at countries, and countries are usually governments. So this is how countries or politicians or policymakers, why they engage with PISA, or how they buy into, or why they find it attractive. But there are not enough studies yet why businesses find PISA interesting. We only started to have a discussion why businesses find education interesting, but we should maybe move on and say what is there to gain for businesses to engage with standardized tests such as PISA. So let's look at the business interest in PISA and TIMSS, and this is the study that I mentioned to you. This was a media analysis with 2 master's students from Teachers College, Columbia University, Margaret Appleton and Shezleen Vellani. They did the data entry, they did the analysis using, for the quantitative part, Google Data Miner and ProQuest, and for the qualitative analysis, NVivo. There were 3, we picked on purpose media outlets that are associated with the business world, that are read by the business community. So we took the Financial Times, which is a daily, and the Wall Street Journal, also daily, plus the Economist, which is a weekly magazine. And they looked back and they looked for keywords, OECD, PISA, TIMSS, many different, public education, school reform. And we analyzed the 3 most common narratives on education are the following. The first one is the tendency to scandalize public education, to say how poorly public education is doing. 39 out of the 55 articles that they analyzed, or we analyzed together, interpreted together, focused on league losers and league slippers. So you can, league slippers is Finland, an example for league slipper that used to be the top and then slipped. And you would think that PISA is there to learn something about the well-performing education systems. But the business community tends to focus on the ones that lose out, on the education systems that are not doing well, which was very interesting for me. It was surprising. So for instance, the Financial Times, December, Singapore and Shanghai results in 2012 were seen as a wake-up call for schools across Britain. Or things like, what is that American policymakers do not get about proficiency in math? So it is this very, scolding tone about public education not doing well. So this was one business narrative that was very strong. A second one And this one is also used in combination with the low-fee private schools that a big number of colleagues in comparative education focus on, including our colleague Prachi Srivastava. I think she would be, I would call her a leading scholar in this field. Schools in developing countries that only cost $1 a week. And the argument, and this was a special number in the summer, I think 2 years ago, the argument is made that public education is so poor, doing so poorly in terms of quality, that even poor parents are ready to pay education. It's so private school is not only something for rich parents, but even poor parents prefer paying money for a private school rather than sending their child. So this is the whole narrative also of low-fee private school. And there's a zillion of research, meanwhile, analyzing that claim, whether they are really higher quality or not. But this is the way it is talked about. So the second one narrative is government spending on education has no impact on the quality of education. Actually, 17 of 55 articles focus on this non-correlation. If you have seen, was it 2009 and 2010, there were two reports that McKinsey published when Michael Barber was still with McKinsey. And the first few pages, it's all about, it doesn't matter how much a government spends on education, class size doesn't matter, resources doesn't matter, it's other things that matter for the quality of education, such as accountability or clear benchmarks, etc. So we could find the same narrative very strongly in those three financial media outlets. These are examples, like, for instance, just citations from Wall Street Journal, how Italian regions with the lowest scores are precisely those where expenditure per student is the largest. So this is a very mean thing to say, actually, that it doesn't matter how much you spend on education, that it doesn't really have an impact on the quality. So basically, but the business argument is, it doesn't matter how much money you give to the education sector, but if you keep the actors in education accountable, if it's spent effectively, wisely, etc. The third one, that's important for your project at the Autonomous University in Barcelona, maybe, it's really strong, this whole argument on accountability or the lack thereof. And it's closely linked with the scandalization discourse. From the 80% of the articles that talk about scandalization do that concurrently with the argument of lack of accountability. And here there's a citation, a reference to Andreas Schleicher directly by Wall Street Journal. The recipe for success, as project director Andreas Schleicher explained at a recent briefing, is a decentralized system where schools are given a large degree of autonomy over the curriculum and budget decisions. Whether schools are public or private is not as important as whether they operate like a private one. I find that very interesting citation, because supposedly businesses, this was maybe before the World Economic Crisis, 2018. Supposedly businesses are more accountable than the public sector. But this at that time was the belief that you can trust business more than public. I think the US, we are coming back to that whole discourse of that time. So let's talk about the third one. So this was the media analysis that tried to understand how did the business interest in education grow? And the answer is yes, absolutely. And especially in those sectors of the business community that is at the same time in education business, such as Pearson with the Economist. And also the media analysis tried to look at how do businesses talk about education? How do they analyze success or failure in education? It was an interesting study, and there's no way we could have analyzed all the data that entered that data set. But let me take you one step further and talk about the public and the private from a theory perspective. From a theory perspective, and this is I'm very strongly influenced by German colleagues, system theory is big in especially the critical kind, not the one that is politically naive. There's also politically naive type of system theory. But there are progressive system theories in Germany and in Scandinavia especially, that look at the public and the private as two subsystems of a system, and because they are subsystems, they interact and communicate with each other. And because they communicate, they have to speak each other's language in order to be understood. And once you communicate, you adopt beliefs and mechanisms and values of the other system. And one of the pieces that Niels Andersen, Asgerud Andersen wrote, he's from Copenhagen Business School. He analyzed that whole belief in governance by numbers or evidence-based policy planning. He says by having this claim about evidence-based policy planning from a systems theory perspective, Luhmannian perspective, it means that numbers or science enters the political sphere and politics enters the academic or the research sphere. This is what I mean with interaction. So that's what we call in social science research, we call agenda-driven research, has become part of evidence-based policy planning. It's another way of saying that politics entered research. But also research entered politics, that politicians rely on data in order to justify an argument in democracy. So this is an example of interaction between two subsystems that communicate with each other, and because they communicate and interact, adopt thinking of the other. So, for instance, the public discourse in public education always used to be about the quality of education and access. That discourse about quality and access is now completely adopted by the private sector. And I'll bring you an example. For instance, it's an interesting marriage between the Right to Education Act that South Africa and India has and that's spreading around the globe, which is a rights-based approach to education that the private sector uses as an argument to introduce low-fee private schools, because low-fee private schools and low-cost private schools especially are seen as a way to spread education to bigger masses of education. Vice versa, the private sector is dominated by a logic of lower costs and scaling up. The same product for many more is a way to have lower cost and to be cost effective. That whole argument of cost effectiveness, which is a business thinking, private sector thinking, is being adopted by the public sector. The whole argument of cost effectiveness has become a big one right now. For instance, in the US, it's very strong, the attack against university-based teacher education or university-based training of school principals. And there's a move to say it's not cost effective because many of them never become teachers or don't stay teachers, or the quality is not necessarily better if they are trained at the university as opposed to the workplace. So this thinking, again, it is actually a business thinking, but it's adopted by the public sector. So using this interpretive framework, this system theory, Luhmannian framework, where there is this area of interaction where they converge, the two have to converge. And in fact, if you can look at it also, they have to adopt each other's values and mechanisms and language for survival, because they're competition to each other. These two subsectors are competition to each other. So if public education in many countries want to stay in business, they have to be more cost effective. If private sector wants to expand in countries where public education is strong, they have to make the quality argument. And of course, PISA is at the forefront, because PISA and TIMSS, it's all about measuring quality and proving that what you have to offer as a private provider is high quality. Let's continue with speaking the language of the other. So these are a couple of things where the two subsectors interact. When there's the government as a provider, the logic of the government as a provider of education is that it's free. There's no cost, and there are costs for special services, but other than that, there should be no cost. And the cost for special services, if there's like after-school program, etc. But of course, we know, especially in North America, and there are studies done on that, where schools more and more became free only for core subjects, and everything that was not considered a core subject or special class or after-school class became a matter of extra fees. But even for core subjects and for core business of schools, parents are enlisted for fundraising for any special activity. Then the business as providers, there is a really interesting tendency for, bilateral donors, World Bank, international donors like World Bank, but also bilateral donors like DEFID especially, to really support low-cost schools. And this has been a big problem in development work and education, that a lot of projects, because the funders are accountable to their own headquarters in Washington or Paris or where have you, they usually are Cadillacs. They're very expensive projects that are not replicable. They cannot be scaled up because they have high quality standards. So the new tendency that is moved in together with private sector involvement in education is to have low cost projects or schools in developing countries that are sustainable, but not only sustainable, but also then eventually will be transformed into low fee schools. For instance, Brock, which is like, for all of us who are in development work, is like the mother of all NGOs, that everyone was the golden bullet in development work in Bangladesh. Brock started out as a free NGO, alternative small primary schools in rural areas, and is now turned into a low fee school. So, and they charge fee, they have Pearsons come in, and they have, they collaborate with businesses. So eventually, of course, the logic is not that everything is, I should sit, I'm sorry, this is a little test to keep you awake, make sure you're still listening. So it moved from low cost to low fee, and the idea of low fee and low cost school is that eventually, and that's the hope of businesses, that governments introduce voucher schemes whereby the money doesn't necessarily come from parents, or comes from parents and from vouchers from the state following the child. The last one was how businesses talk the language of public education. This is how public education speaks the language of business. So this is now the other way around. And here, this is this model that Tony Verger and Susan Robertson presented in their book. It is a visualization of how neoliberal reform or the market model in education works. It's a logic, it's a business logic actually. The business logic is, if you have many different providers and you have a competition, and you create that competition by having parental choice. Parents have the right to send their child to whatever school they want, and schools get for every child money per capita financing. Plus you have tests, you have an evaluation system, an information system that spreads the news how well or poorly a school is doing, that this will create this mechanism. It's a perpetuum mobile that will enforce competition, and competition will improve quality of education. at the same time lowering the cost. That's a really market model in education. And this is what Stephen Ball calls endemic privatization. It's which leads to private sector being invited into the public education system. It is also the PPP model, public-private partnership, because it's government money used to give to the private sector in the form of vouchers and what have you. So these were the two slides to show how, even though this is the public sector, it thinks like the business. It thinks that competition creates better quality. And the slide before was about how businesses think or speak like the public sector. Let me finish by talking about cost reduction strategies in public education. This is like the last section. And I'll have a couple of slides on that one to show how business logic has entered into public education. And again, my suggestion is we shouldn't be seeing like a state, which is the tradition, but we should also count like a business in order to understand how public education is being changed or has changed. So one of them is lowering production and delivery costs. This is a business, in any business strategy, you have this kind of thinking that it's a good idea to lower production and delivery costs. It's almost like messianic belief that computers and digitalization of education will lower the cost of education and produce better results. It's almost like a global education movement or policy. They believe in digitalization with the idea that this way you can have it's like a chain reaction, because if you have more digitalization, you need lower skilled labor. You can just put a teacher in the classroom who has very little training because the program does it for the teacher and the textbook does it, etc. For a variety of reasons, there's a buy-in into digitalization in education. The other one is also the delivery cost like training of teachers. And as I mentioned earlier, Teach for All, Teach for America. Do you have Teach for Spain?
Yeah.
Do you have Teach for Spain?
Yeah.
Even Catalonia?
Yeah.
Wow. So this is also like a huge global movement, how it's everywhere now. And again, if in policy borrowing research, we would be not just only describing that phenomenon of these cheaper ways of teacher training, but we would try to understand why different countries buy into it. At what particular moment? Is it because they're not unionized? Is there a teacher shortage? Why is it attractive? So this is also a way of reducing delivery costs, because you have a cheaper way of producing teachers. Another one, that's another business logic adopted in public education, is to have long-term sales and service contracts. I'm now using business talk with you on purpose. But the idea is to have, and that's why test industry is really powerful, and PISA contributed to the belief in tests as a quality monitor and as an assurance policy, basically linked to assurance policies. The reasons why testing companies, for instance, participate also in PISA and OECD, it's not much money to be made from PISA yet, but the product that they can sell for doing similar tests, standardized tests, or textbooks preparing for those tests, for competencies, 21st century skills, or the teacher training, preparing for teaching, that's where the money comes in. That's where you can make money. by starting out having a standardized test, then adapting everything, the key competencies, the standards to the test, the curriculum framework, the teacher training, and the textbooks. And all these other products are the ones that make tests and test companies profitable for companies. Along with this is the idea nowadays that there are only two sectors in all of society that are lifelong and every individual person is affected by. One is the education sector, everyone has to go to school in the 21st century, and the other one is the health sector. And that's like the two sectors with the economy of scale where you can reach huge numbers from, in education especially, from grade 1 to 12, and then if it continues even more. And the thing is, once you have this circle, this coherent circle, it is like having a service contract with Apple or any computer system. You are bought into the system, and you depend on that service contract because all the bits and pieces belong together. The thing about introducing a fee structure, and I love this chapter that Natasha Ridge and Kippos and Shami produced for the co-edited volume, and I always bring that example because it's so illustrative. They looked at the GEMS network. It's a network of schools based in the Emirates, and the owner of that chain of schools is Mr. Warki, Sonny Warki, and this is the citations from that article, from that book chapter. It says, the business idea of a fee structure applied to education means, and now I'm citing him, we developed the airline model of economy, business, and first class to make top-notch education available based on what families can afford. So remember, this is again, it is actually public education discourse to talk about quality and access, because his argument is we make it accessible for everyone. So this is an example of like what we are used today with almost like every product, except for instance with Dropbox, if it's very little megabyte, it's free, and then you have to pay more. Like with everything, we have a fee structure in business. This is a fee structure adapted to education. And we have that fee structure also in public education in many countries. If you don't want any special classes or additional classes, you can go to public education. But for everything additional, you have to pay. So this whole discussion, remember, the core curriculum and core subject leads to this differentiation of what should be free and what should be considered additional. So the fee structure, this on the left side, this is an article written by Sue Winton on schools in Ontario, where she analyzed how parents must do fundraising, and that's not a new phenomenon, fundraising in public schools, because again there's a differentiation which part of schooling is free and which part of schooling is additional. But then you also have hybrid models in public education where the private sector is in the public sector, such as for instance schools that offer IB track within public education, international baccalaureate. We have like a school in Switzerland, in Basel, where it's a gymnasium, and they have to pay nothing if it's just, in German, and the regular curriculum. But if they want, in addition, the IB recognition, they have to pay. Parents have to pay more. Plus, the school and the state pays a lot because IB has to be taught by specific teachers who have a specific certificate with specific tests and specific textbooks, etc. The reason, and we talked a little bit about that, that TIMSS, the reason it is interesting to analyze why PISA is so much more popular than TIMSS. Keep in mind that PISA is 21st century skills, competency based, whereas TIMSS compares what students are supposed to learn in a country, intended curriculum, let's say, with the actual curriculum and the achieved curriculum. So it is very much national, it's territorial. So you cannot really scale up. It is very national based, whereas PISA is transnational with 21st century skill, which makes it much more attractive for businesses, because with PISA, you can basically use the same test everywhere, and you can not only use it for every country, but for every region, and eventually for every school. So there is this whole movement, and we spoke about it this morning. I mean, I was surprised the first time I saw that Shanghai was allowed to participate as a region of China. OECD is so authoritative and so strict on methodology. They could have stopped it the first day already to say, and now it's like taking a ridiculous scope with Macau and Hong Kong, all these regions joining rather than, countries. It could have stopped that development and say, no, we are just a nation state test, but it didn't. And because I think that the trend is going to that direction, to have PISA not only for countries, but PISA for regions, PISA for schools. David Rutkowski wrote about that. And as Radhika Gorur from Melbourne says, there's PISA for babies very soon. So PISA is expanding both in terms of age, and in terms of geographically. So the idea is to have more and more entities participate in standardized tests such as PISA, but at the same time, you can scale up the textbooks that go with it, the teacher training that go with it, and what have you. But the last slide is actually that one I wanted to show you that, but I just like the title, and I heard that title, Fazal Rizvi said I should read that book, Weapons of Math Destruction, about data mining. And one of the things that she says is that for businesses to be lucrative, they have to sell the same product, not once or twice, but 100 times. That's why PISA is more interesting than TIMSS, because it's deterritorialized. It's not one national education system. So standards are good for business, really good for business, because you can use the same and reproduce it. So she says the weapons of math destruction tend to punish the poor. This is in part because they are engineered to evaluate large numbers. They specialize in bulk and they're cheap. The wealthy, by contrast, often benefit from personal input. They don't depend on buying the cheaper product. Just think of clothes and everything else. They can go not following standards, but individually tailored products. Same for, low-fee private school as opposed to high-fee private schools. There are small classes tailored to the needs of students. The wealthy are processed more by people, the masses by machines. So let me end here, and so we have a discussion, and my apology for this excellent slide from John Mayer that was slipped in there.
Thank you very much for a lot of things to think about and so it's very, very, very interesting presentation. So I just want you to, I think that PISA, in the way it's organized recently, they're really making a move to be more attractive for businesses, more than they already are, as you showed us. As they are also, in the last one, they've also introduced this measuring how interactive. So they have, it hasn't been launched yet, it's going to be launched, I think, towards the summer this year. But in this 2015 PISA test, they also had this set of activities where the kids were invited to have collaborative solutions to certain problems. So they would link online to other students and then have to find solutions in a collaborative way. And this is clearly a measure of knowledge, or a type of knowledge that really appeals to business. That is, they will be able to adopt this measure to understand how the people in certain country can have this type of soft skills that the business is so much. So I'm wondering to what extent aren't now these big companies really inside PISA and doing the tests themselves? So it's not PISA influencing the business, but the business influencing the design of PISA as a tool that they can then use. And I'd like to listen to your comments.
Okay.
Good. Xavier?
Thank you. I am Xavier Ramos from Sociology. I wanted to draw on your comments on the system theory and analysis, because you mentioned that we could think of business and the state as kind of subsystems, and I wondered about civil society, social movements and advocacy coalitions and so on. They have been actually campaigning for budget tracking or linking education to taxation, and this kind of ideas seem to be included somehow in the global agenda for education. And I wonder to what extent that you take them into account in order to have a complex view of the whole process.
The second point about the PISA is very interesting. I follow that also with great interest, and I think ETS was involved, but Pearson most recently, 2015, was a partner, became a partner of PISA, so especially for the computer-based test taking. But I wonder what is not enough discussed, and I wonder what happens with PISA for development, whether PISA for development is also so much relies on technical literacy, technological literacy. But that's the other type of inequality that is coming with the digital divide. That is, I don't think, discussed enough with the 21st century skill. Is part of it is also about team building, problem solving, technological solutions, and this. So what does that mean for countries in developing countries? I'm curious whether PISA for development comes up with totally different competencies and skills. I'm, Camila Adi would know, and colleagues like her, but I wouldn't know what the answer is. The thing about Javier, the thing about civil society as a third subsector, there's this whole debate about, which makes it actually very interesting, like this interaction between using the language of the right to education, which is a advocacy talk, it's a human rights talk used by businesses. It also exists, the same civil society talk exists for businesses explaining the importance of making transparent the quality of education by having more and more tests. This is actually democracy talk originally, to say we need standardized tests because parents pay taxes, they have the right to know how good the school in their neighborhood is doing, and they should have a choice. So how much of it is, for me, that's more public versus private rather than civil society. It's public talk adopted by the private sector. But of course it would make it even more complicated. In many countries, NGOs, even though they're non-profit, they have become more and more businesses by now. So that old type of grassroots NGOs has become very rare.
I would like to know whether we are talking about this kind of pro-privatization translation of PISA, and whether we can find opportunities for using or translating this PISA in a more progressive way. I give you 3 examples. For instance, through PISA we know that the possibilities to repetition with the same level of competences is unequally distributed among socioeconomic groups, being poor having much more opportunities to be great, for instance. Or what we, the example that Marjolaine gave this morning about the discovering of gender inequalities on the Norwegian systems. Or, for instance, in Catalonia we have a long-standing debate about private against public schools qualities, and through this kind of international learning standardized tests, we knew that there's no statistical significance when we put out this socioeconomic. This is just this is just to say, okay, as you said, PISA has been used in this narrative pro-privatization, pro-marketization, but could it be also space for using this test, or under what circumstances we can find a space for using this test or a more progressive educational approach?
Okay.
How can PISA be used progressively? And actually, I think even Schleicher, when the PISA shock came out in Germany, one argument that he was pushing for is that the German system is too selective and too segregated. And one of the reasons why Germany scored low was because it is residentially segregated, structurally segregated, with Oberschule and Gymnasium and all that. If
Early tracking.
Early tracking. It should be less tracked and more integrated. So he tried to make a progressive argument on having less selection and have immigrant students be in normal or regular classes rather than in Sonderschulen or Oberschulen and what have you. But ultimately nobody listened, and it didn't change structurally the education system in Germany. But there are uses. Of course it can be used progressively, but the impact, to come to Javier's first point, it's still bad on the whole education system because it introduces an excessive culture of testing. But of course some use it positively. One of the doctoral students we have now at Teachers College, who's maybe also watching, Chan Woon-baek, he worked with in Korea at KEDI, where they this is very reputable education research institution in Seoul, where they evaluated the reform that the Korean schools did based on PISA reception. Korea is an interesting case. They are doing always very well, but they are not proud of it. And because they say our students do well, but not necessarily because of the schools, but because of this private tutoring after the schools and this test obsession. And it's stressful for the children. There's children suicide, teacher suicide, So they see the stress that test puts on students, and as a result, you could say progressively interpreting PISA, they have introduced like 1 year where there's no test taken, just to give it a change. So of course you can use it progressively, but it's still on the whole system, it has an impact also.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Do we have more questions in the room? If not, I have maybe one last question from Camila Adi, a person that you have been quoting quite a lot in your great lecture, and she says, "Great lecture, Gita. Thanks. It's so important that scholars start to look into and discuss the ILCA's industry and the implications for education. The question is, would you argue that the way the OECD is developing its tests is promoting the privatization of education?"
The way it is promoting, like the collaboration with Pearson and
I think
I think so. Yeah, because as I said, from what I hear, participating in the test is not lucrative, but getting the reputation of being able to help PISA to get on board with the digitalized versions of test taking, and then producing textbooks for that, and teacher training for that, and schools for that. That's what makes it really lucrative. And in one of the slides was to show that nowadays, it used to be very boring and sequential. When there would be a curriculum reform in a country, countries would start out with an agreement, and it would take like 2-3 years, and professionals and politicians would come together. They would start out with a curriculum framework, discuss the goals and visions of education, and then for each subject, and it would take years, and then the textbook, and then the test. But now it's backward mapping. Now the test drives everything else. And I think PISA, the 21st century skills, drives now curriculum reform. It's the test first, and then based on what the test is or the competencies in that test that are being measured, the things are developed. This gives, of course, a great advantage to test developing businesses, such as Pearson, but also ETS and others. Those are Cambridge International. They are the ones that have a lot of business now in education, both in terms of consultancies, but also for textbook development and teacher training development.
Okay. So thank you very much. I am sure that Camila is happy with your answer. I would like to thank you for your very original and provocative understanding of the role of this international test in educational system. So thank you very much for